Good evening, and welcome to the June 24th Wednesday night Bible class of the Boone Church of Christ. We're continuing to talk about the importance of developing a heart for God, and we're looking at David's heart and at his life to better understand what type of heart pleases God. Tonight, we're going to talk about developing a heart of dependence on God. How do you approach decisions in life? How do you go about making plans? Some people are more spontaneous, while others are more deliberate. Regardless of your approach, the Christian ought to always be considering God in their planning. David has become king, and his first official act as king of Israel was restoring the proper worship of God. Central to the Israelites' worship was the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark was a wooden chest with a pure gold covering that contained the 2 stone tablets of the 10 Commandments. The ark served as Israel's guide in the journey through the wilderness, and the ark also served as a symbol of God's presence. The Philistines had captured the ark. They'd captured it and they'd held it for a long time, and David wanted to bring it back to Jerusalem. He had defeated the Philistines, so there was nothing stopping him now. As David set out to move the ark, though not all went smoothly, there were some snags along the way. Tonight we're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 6. There are 2 parts of the story in 2 Samuel 6 that we're going to take a look at. The first is in verses 1 through 11. They chronicle David's first attempt to bring the ark back to Jerusalem. This first effort, though, was defined by failure. Verses 12 through 15 are the account of David's second attempt to bring the ark back to Jerusalem, and this time he was successful. What happened to David the first time he tried? He failed. Why did he fail? And why was his second attempt successful? And what lessons can we learn from the things that David went through? Well, let's begin by reading verses 1 through 11 of 2 Samuel chapter 6, which again chronicle the events that surrounded David's first attempt that had resulted in a failure. Then David again gathered all the elite troops of Israel, 30,000 in all. He led them to Bela of Judah to bring back the ark of God, which bears the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, who is enthroned between the cherubim. They placed the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from Abinadab's house, which was on a hill. Uzzah and Ahio, Abinadab's sons, were guiding the cart that carried the ark of God. Ahio walked in front of the ark. David and all the people of Israel were celebrating before the Lord, singing songs and playing all kinds of musical instruments: lyres, harps, tambourines, castanets, and cymbals. But when they arrived at the threshing floor of Nacon, the oxen stumbled, and Uzzah reached out his hand and steadied the ark of God. Then the Lord's anger was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him dead because of this. So Uzzah died right there beside the ark of God. David was angry because the Lord's anger had burst out against Uzzah. He named that place Perez Uzzah, which means to burst out against Uzzah, as it is still called today. David was now afraid of the Lord and asked, "How can I ever bring the ark of the Lord back into my care?" So David decided not to move the ark of the Lord into the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom of Gath. The ark of the Lord remained there in Obed-Edom's house for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household. What happened when David tried to move the ark the first time? Well, the central part of the story was that Uzzah was killed. When we read this, this can cause some confusion. Why was he killed? Wasn't he just trying to help? Well, there's much more to the story. See, God had given very specific instructions regarding the movement of the ark. God had outlined his instructions about how to deal with all of the holy items involved in the worship of him. One of the places where these instructions can be found in detail is in Numbers 4. They are referred to in other places in the Old Testament. Here's just an example from that section. The Kohathite tribe was assigned by God to carry much of the sacred objects. But before they could carry them, they had to at first be covered by Aaron and his sons. So Aaron and his sons would go into the tent, they'd cover these sacred objects. The reason why that had to be done was because the Kohathites were not even to look at them. If they looked at them, they would die. God was serious about his instructions relative to their worship of him. Well, we need some background information to really understand what happened and why that first attempt failed and why Uzzah died and all of the things that surrounded that. So we're going to go to 1 Chronicles chapter 13 and take a look at verses 1 through 10. Here in 1 Chronicles 13, 1 through 10, the very same event is discussed, but there's some more information provided than what we see in 2 Samuel chapter 6. David consulted with all his officials, including the generals and captains of his army. Then he addressed the entire assembly of Israel as follows: "If you approve, and it is the will of the Lord our God, let us send messengers to all the Israelites throughout the land, including the priests and Levites in their towns and pasture lands. Let us invite them to come and join us. It is time to bring back the ark of our God, for we neglected it during the reign of Saul." The whole assembly agreed to this, for the people could see it was the right thing to do. So David summoned all Israel from the Sheor brook of Egypt in the south all the way to the town of Lebo-Hamath in the north to join in bringing the ark of God from Kiriath-Jearim. Then David and all Israel went to Bela of Judah, also called Kiriath-Jearim, to bring back the ark of God, which bears the name of the Lord who is enthroned between the cherubim. They placed the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from Abinadab's house. Uzzah and Ahio were guiding the cart. David and all Israel were celebrating before God with all their might, singing songs and playing all kinds of musical instruments: lyres, harps, tambourines, cymbals, and trumpets. But when they arrived at the threshing floor of Nacon, the oxen stumbled, and Uzzah reached out his hand to steady the ark. But the Lord's anger was aroused against Uzzah, and he struck him dead because he had laid his hand on the ark. So Uzzah died there in the presence of God. Well, some things to notice so far. Again, we haven't read enough yet to really understand what went wrong, but let's just take some note of some things that we have read here from 1 Chronicles chapter 13. Who did David consult with regarding his plans to bring the ark of God back to Jerusalem? We talked about that. How do you go about making plans? Are you spontaneous, or do you think things through, and are you more deliberate? Do you seek counsel? Well, here David did seek counsel. Who did he seek counsel from? In the first attempt, he consulted with the generals and captains of his army. David consulted with the military leaders. How did they move the ark? Here in 1 Chronicles 13, we learn that they moved the ark on a new cart. Where do you suppose they came up with that idea? Because, see, that's not in God's law. In 1 Samuel chapter 6, verse 7, we read this: "Now build a new cart and find 2 cows that have just given birth to calves. Make sure the cows have never been yoked to a cart. Hitch the cows to a cart, but shut their calves away from them in a pen." And what was that? Who came up with that idea? Who was being quoted there in 1 Samuel chapter 6, verse 7? Well, it was the Philistines. They had captured the ark, remember? And so, and they were holding the ark, and they had some things happen as a result of holding that ark. They'd gotten sick. There were people who were dying. It didn't take them long to connect the dots, and they realized that having the Lord's ark there among them was a problem, and they needed to figure out a way to get the ark back to the Israelites. So they're the ones that came up with the idea of putting it on a new cart, which is exactly what David had tried to do in his first attempt. So what happened when David moved the ark the second time? Well, let's go back to 2 Samuel. We're going to read verses 9 through 15 from 2 Samuel chapter 6. Part of this we read before, and I'm going to start with that part beginning in verse 9 that we've already read, because it sets the stage for what comes later. David was now afraid of the Lord, and he asked, "How can I ever bring the ark of the Lord back into my care?" So David decided not to move the ark of the Lord into the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom of Gath. The ark of the Lord remained there in Obed-Edom's house for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household. Now, we had read that. Now listen to the rest of this. Then King David was told, "The ark has blessed Obed-Edom's household and everything he has because of the ark of God." So David went there and brought the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with great celebration. After the men who were carrying the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, David sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf, and David danced before the Lord with all his might, wearing a priestly garment. So David and all the people of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts of joy and the blowing of ram's horns. What was different the second time the ark was moved? Well, honestly, we don't get very much from 2 Samuel chapter 6 on that. It sounds as if just what we read, that David realized that the Lord had blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household because of the presence of the ark, and so David decided, well, then that means we ought to get the ark back here in Jerusalem, so let's just go get it. So they went and got it. Again, there's a lot more to the story than that. We just don't get the full story here in 2 Samuel. We have to dig deeper. So let's go back to 1 Chronicles. We already read about the failed first attempt to move the ark in 1 Chronicles chapter 13. Now we're going to go to 1 Chronicles chapter 15. And there we get some background information of David's successful move of the ark back to Jerusalem. As we read this, see if you can detect what was different about the second time the ark was moved. Beginning in verse 1. David now built several buildings for himself in the city of David. He also prepared a place for the ark of God and set up a special tent for it. Then he commanded, "No one except the Levites may carry the ark of God. The Lord has chosen them to carry the ark of the Lord and to serve him forever." Then David summoned all Israel to Jerusalem to bring the ark of the Lord to the place he had prepared for it. This is the number of the descendants of Aaron, the priests, and the Levites who were called together. And we have from different clans the total number of priests and Levites that were called together along with their leaders. Then David summoned the priests Zadok and Abiathar and these Levite leaders. And he mentions some others. And he said to all of them, "You are the leaders of the Levite families. You must purify yourselves and all your fellow Levites so that you can bring the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel, to the place I have prepared for it. Because you Levites did not carry the ark the first time, the anger of the Lord, our God, burst out against us. We failed to ask God how to move it properly. So the priests and the Levites purified themselves in order to bring the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel, to Jerusalem. Then the Levites carried the ark of God on their shoulders with its carrying poles, just as the Lord had instructed Moses. David also ordered the Levite leaders to appoint a choir of Levites, who were singers and musicians, to sing joyful songs to the accompaniment of harps, lyres, and cymbals. And then there's a listing of all of those involved in that. We're going to skip down to verse 25. Then David and the elders of Israel and the generals of the army went to the house of Obed-Edom to bring the ark of the Lord's covenant up to Jerusalem with a great celebration. And because God was clearly helping the Levites as they carried the ark of the Lord's covenant, they sacrificed 7 bulls and 7 rams. David was dressed in a robe of fine linen, as were all of the Levites who carried the ark, and also the singers and Kenaniah the choir leader. David was also wearing a priestly garment. So all of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord's covenant with shouts of joy, the blowing of ram's horns and trumpets, the crashing of cymbals, and loud playing on harps and lyres. So what differences did you notice? There were actually quite a few, but only some of them were of vital importance in regards to them being successful the second time they brought the ark. First off, who did David consult with about moving the ark? In the introduction, I'd asked the question, how do you go about making plans? How do you go about making decisions? Some people are more spontaneous. Some people are more deliberate in their approach. Well, David was a little more deliberate in his approach. Who did he consult with about moving the ark? Well, the first time, David consulted with his political officials and military commanders. But who did he consult with the second time? Not them. The second time, David consulted with the priests and the Levite leaders. David didn't go to a military source to get advice about how to deal with a matter of faith. David went to the religious leaders the second time to get advice relative to how to deal with this moving of the ark, this issue of worship, this matter of faith. And how was the ark moved? That was the second key difference. The first time the ark was moved on a new cart. You know, that might have sounded logical. I'm sure it probably did at the time, otherwise they wouldn't have done it. Problem was that God never commanded that. What about the second time the ark was moved? Well, David says it well here in 1 Chronicles 15:2. Then David commanded, no one except the Levites may carry the ark of God. The Lord has chosen them to carry the ark of the Lord and to serve him forever. Not only did the Levites carry the ark of the God, it was not placed on a cart, but the Levites were not even allowed to touch the ark of the covenant. That's what the carrying poles were for. They had to slip them through carefully so that no one made contact with the ark of God. Verse 6 of 1 Chronicles 15 says that God was clearly helping the Levites as they carried the ark of the Lord's covenant. Just in those two areas, who David consulted with and really specifically how they moved the ark of the covenant, do you see what the main problem was on the first attempt to move the ark? 1 Chronicles 15:13, David had said, because you Levites did not carry the ark the first time, the anger of the Lord our God burst out against us. God had told the Levites to carry the ark always, forever. And they made a change when they put the ark on a new cart. That created a real problem for them. Listen to the last part of verse 13. David said, we failed to ask God how to move it properly. That was the problem. The problem was they didn't seek God's will. So what do we see in David's heart that can help us as we seek to learn God's will and serve him in faithful obedience? You know, what are the lessons here for us? Well, one thing we see about David was his willingness to go back to the drawing board and seek God's will in obedience. David knew that he hadn't sought God's will the first time. You know, he didn't make excuses. He didn't become embittered. He was afraid. But after processing that, he realized, I've got to learn and I've got to change. And David did change. Through his humble obedience, a heart of dependence on God was renewed in him. Another thing that we see here, and it's a huge lesson in this passage, is that God cares very much about our obedience. No amount of unity or enthusiasm can ever compensate for disobedience. God's work must be done in God's way if it is to have God's blessing. But what if we meant well? Are we right to be angry when God doesn't appreciate our best efforts? Well, maybe we need to look at it this way. Is it really our best effort when we enthusiastically and in our minds sincerely act without knowledge? If we really want to please God, then we'll always prioritize His will in our decisions. If we're sincere, we will seek His will. And this is true in all areas of our lives. And this story in particular emphasizes that it's especially true when it comes to our worship of God. God's holiness was not to be compromised, not even with good motives. And another thing that we see here with David was his willingness to put forth the effort to serve God. You know, it was no easy task getting the ark to Jerusalem. a 50-mile journey on foot carrying the ark through the mountains. Of course, we also saw that God helped the Levites. Once they were obedient to him, God helped. But it also took a humble heart and a high degree of diligence for David to accept his failure and seek God's will. So the question for us is, how much effort are we willing to put into worshiping God and seeking his will? How serious are we about developing a heart of dependence on God?